Meshomasic has always had a particular fascination for me. I remember as a kid, I began to explore the woods behind my house, and as I ventured deeper into the woods, I found rows of pine trees growing in the woods with a road meandering through them, and being too young at the time to explore any farther for fear of getting lost. And then a little while later, I was going up towards the reservoir area, and I remember finding in the woods a brick structure, a round brick building with burnt wood inside of it, not knowing what that was. And then in the 1980s, I was sitting on the porch of my house, and I looked up towards Raccoon Hill, which is in the middle of the state forest, and I saw a light shining from the top of the hill. And I didn't know what the cause of the light was, and I got curious, and I decided to go up and explore the hill and find out what it was. And I got to the base of the hill only to discover a whole series of ledges and caves going up towards the top of the hill. And so I began to work my way up through the ledges, and sure enough, I got to the top of the hill to discover that the source of my light was a tin can lid that was nailed to a tree, probably left by a deer hunter to mark his stand. Not exactly the burning bush of Moses in the Bible, but it was the thing to spur me on to discover more about Meshomasic and to find out its secrets. So today I ask you join me in my search of Meshomasic and find the enjoyment that I too have found. On the eastern side of the Connecticut River, and just north of the Big Bend, the eastern highlands rise abruptly and gradually spread out to form the Bolton Range. This range, the most rugged topography of the eastern uplands, is home to Meshomasic, the oldest state forest in New England and the second oldest in the entire country. Comprising lands in the towns of East Hampton, Glastonbury, and Marlborough, Meshomasic's greatest acreage is found in Portland, where almost 1/3 of the town is forest. Including isolated pockets of private and town property, the forest area covers over 10,000 acres, 8,000 of which is state-owned. The glacial ice sheet, which began receding approximately 20,000 years ago, had scraped the hills clean of soil, leaving boulders known as glacial erratics and boulder fields in their place. With the formation of the continents, the forces beneath the Earth's surface created a bedrock dominated by hard, metamorphic rock, giving outcroppings a strong, layered texture. In 1632, when Dutch and English settlers first came to the area, they found the river valley adjacent to Meshomasic occupied by the Wangunk Indians, a subgroup of the larger tribe collectively known as the Connecticut River Indians. It was from the heirs of Sauhig, the grand sachem of these Indians, that the English purchased the lands to become Meshomasic in 1672. The larger, more powerful Mohegan and Pequot tribes in southeastern Connecticut also laid claim to hunting grounds in this area. This conflict of ownership contributed to the animosity between the English and the Pequots, which resulted in the Pequot Massacre of 1637. The name Meshomasic means great snake in reference to the abundance of timber rattlesnakes found in the area. Before the Wangunk Indians left this area, early settlers were known to have supplied hunting parties with fire for cooking. A cranberry marsh in the Bucktown district on the western edge of Meshomasic was famed for its large deer population. A large number of arrowheads and Indian artifacts have been found there. DeForest, speaking about the primeval wilderness, wrote in 1859, "A continuous forest overspread the whole landscape, adorning the hills with its verdure, darkening the valleys with its deep shadow, and bending solemnly over the margins of the rivers. No thickets choked up the way through these endless woodlands, for the brush was swept away every year by fires kindled for this purpose by the inhabitants. Paths led through them here and there, not paths of iron such as those over which the steam horse now flies, but winding footways along which the wild beast and the wild man alike traveled in single file. The small animals, including the white-tailed deer, inhabited the early forest. However, moose, bear, wildcat, and wolves were also prevalent. Today, the eastern coyote, numbering 1,500 to 3,000 animals across the state, is slowly filling the predator niche last occupied by the timber wolf. The shy, reclusive timber rattlesnake continues to call Meshomasic home, but in much reduced numbers. They make their dens on the southern side of ledgy slopes. Don Kelsey, a Portland resident whose family has lived for years near Meshomasic, recalls the rattlesnakes.
I can remember when Joe Sinnott and my father, who was Dan Kelsey, they used to go out with, and it was a sport to go and get rattlesnakes, and they normally would go out in the fall and in the spring. And there were several dens around which they knew about, and they went out. One time they went to they called the it was a Raccoon Hill Den just below the hill there, and under one stone there they took 20-some out one day and another that many out the next day, onto that one rock. But that was the time when they were trying to destroy the snakes rather than save them like we are today. So there were several occasions that Joe Sinnott had no real fear of snakes. He'd take a small forked stick, not over 2 to 3 feet long at the most, and reach down and just put it behind their head and reach down and pick the snake up. Well, the snake would curl around his arm and around him. It would be sometimes 5, 6 feet long, and with the snake, and he'd pry open the jaws and show you the fangs and things like that. But they weren't too lively in the fall when it was cooler weather, but if you tried that in the summertime, it's a little different story. They're quite a lot faster, and it was a little dangerous. My father didn't think much about that. He had a lot of respect for the rattlesnakes. Joe said it used to. Apparently, there was a demand for the venom. He'd milk the snakes, and also there was a demand for the meat, which he disposed of in that way.
The most notable hills of Meshomasic are Pine Hill, elevation 916 feet, where a fire tower stood in the 1930s. Meshomasic Mountain at 897 feet, the highest hill in Portland, and Great Hill, whose overlook commands views of the Connecticut River and the landscape south towards the Sound. By the 18th century, early settlers had begun clearing and farming the lower and flatter regions of the forest, leaving the higher, steeper areas for fuel wood and timber growth. But the shallow, rocky soil of Meshomasic proved too great a challenge to that Yankee spirit. Thus, shortly after the end of the Revolutionary War, the area was slowly deserted. Today, stone walls and abandoned foundations hidden deep in the woods are the only testimony to our earliest residents' struggle to survive. A house which once stood deep in the forest was moved and now sits in the neighboring Bucktown area. The Meshomasic Forest also featured other uses. In 1661, John Winthrop, Connecticut's first governor, began searching for minerals around Great Hill. It was written that, quote, after 3 weeks in the woods of this mountain roasting ores and casting gold rings, he returned to New London with plenty of gold. East Hampton land records identify parcels of land known as the Governor's Ring lots. In 1762, mining was reopened, this time in search of cobalt, thereby naming the place and the nearby village. For 100 years, operations continued off and on by several different people, with limited success, apparently finding as much nickel as cobalt. The mine finally closed for good in 1858 after finding it too costly to process the cobalt. A pest house was built in 1777, 1/2 mile northeast of the present-day reservoir, for victims of the smallpox epidemic to recover or die. A map of the New England region reveals that Meshomasic lies exactly in line with New York City and Boston, With that in mind, the Marlboro Turnpike was built in 1814. However, easier routes were found, and the turnpike soon lost its appeal. The famed naturalist and writer Henry David Thoreau spoke of another Old Marlboro Road in his essay Walking in 1862. He wrote, quote, "However, there are a few old roads that may be trodden with profit, as if they led somewhere now that they are nearly discontinued. There is the Old Marlboro Road, which does not go to Marlboro now, methinks, unless that is Marlboro where it carries me. I am the bolder to speak of it here, because I presume that there are one or two such roads in every town." This description aptly fits part of our Old Marlboro Turnpike, which bisects the forest and today can only be walked. The early forest was quite similar to today's, with some notable exceptions. Fully half of the primeval forest overstory were American chestnuts. The rest of the stand was made up of smaller quantities of oak, hemlock, ash, elm, maple, and white pine. While chestnut still abounds today, it does so in a shrub-like state. The chestnut blight, which struck in the early 1900s, repeatedly kills the stem, forcing the tree to resprout from the unaffected root system. Of course, the primary use of the forest was the harvest of wood products. Fuel wood for heating homes, timber for lumber, masts, posts, barrels, in short, everything, and wood for making charcoal to smelt iron was continually being removed. Don recalls the charcoal pits, which still can be found throughout the forest.
The pits normally would hold between 8 and 12 cord of wood, depending on the supply of wood they had around and you know how much they wanted to put into it. And but the information I had, my Uncle Will was probably the last one, one of the last ones in town that burned charcoal. And I think probably the last burn would have been but probably around World War I time or just prior. After that, the whole effort went into the war effort, and I guess they forgot the charcoal, and also the demand was going. They piled the wood in a cone-shaped vine with the butts facing out or in a circle, right around, leaving a hole in the center and an access hole out to the outside so they could ignite it. And in the center they put kindling, which was probably made up mostly of chestnut, small wood that would burn fast to get it started. And as they went around, they put sod and wet hay and all around the outside of the cone till they got up to whatever height it was. And they didn't want it too high because it would be an effort to get up on there to tend to it. And they had to leave an opening at the top when they first started it so it would draft up through. And the pits had to be somewhere near accessible to a water source, and also they wanted to be fairly near where the wood was going, so you didn't have to draw the wood too far. So they were laid out in various locations around where they wanted them, mostly on a piece of level ground to make it easier.
With overcutting coupled with wildfires, people came to realize they were losing a valuable resource. The writings of Henry David Thoreau and John Muir had called attention to the aesthetic and spiritual values of the forest and wilderness, while the preservation of unique natural areas such as Yellowstone in 1870 spurred others to follow the example. But most of all, people recognized the need to conserve and manage the forest in order to have a continual benefit to the community. In 1900, with American forestry still in its infancy, Walter Mulford was chosen to be Connecticut's first state forester. He selected Portland in 1902 for the first state forest because of its central location in the state and extensive stands of chestnut. He had two objectives in managing the forest. First, to demonstrate how to grow timber, and second, how to control forest fires. Local men and later Yale forestry students began planting trees, primarily white pine, red pine, and Norway spruce, on the old fields and clear-cut areas. The big pines at the junction of Del Reeves and Mulford Roads was the first forest plantation in the state and likely New England, which was planted in 1906. Today, the trees are nearly 2 feet in diameter and over 100 feet tall. Cabin in the Pines was built in 1915 just east of the Portland Reservoir to house Yale students and faculty when they worked on experimental plots in the forest. Joe Sinnott, a forest manager in the 1940s, kept rattlesnakes in a barrel in the cabin in order to milk them and sell it for anti-venom serum.
The forester's cabin stood just east of the reservoir and right on the brook that comes into the reservoir from the east side. It was right off the old Marlboro Turnpike at that time. It was set on a hillside there when amid the pines that were planted, and it was just a log cabin, single room with a kitchen on one end, and it was set up. They built it out of chestnut, native chestnut that was they found out of the forest, and I don't think it was constructed by any carpenters. And there was a fireplace on one end with a big fireplace. And they used it for meetings, forestry meetings, sometimes in the forest. The chief forester would have the rangers come in from various parts of the state, and they also used it occasionally for temporary help that was working in the forest at the time. It stood there off and on. It was sometimes fixed up a little bit, and then sometimes it would be torn apart a little bit. And finally, one winter night, somebody got in there and it got a fire, and nobody really knows when it burned down, except when the snow went off, the cabin was gone, right to the ground.
Forest work continued to be done by local men until the Depression and the formation of the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Cs, as they were called, performed boundary surveying, tree pruning and thinning, mapping, constructing water holes for firefighting, building roads, and controlling insect infestations. Camp Buck on Great Hill Road, today a DEP maintenance depot, and Camp Jenkins near the Cobalt Mine on Gadpouch Road were CCC camps where young and unemployed men lived and worked on the forest.
The first one in the local area here was built near the Cobalt Mines, which is just over the border in East Hampton from here. That was Camp Jenkins, and that they came in there in the summer of '33 and put up tents, and there was at least 200 men there in tents, fed under Army discipline, and they fed them, and while they were building the barracks, and one thing that I will remember that they did, they used to, for entertainment, they would hold, to keep the boys busy at nights, you know, so they wouldn't all wander off, and they would hold prize fights. They built a prize ring there, and they had amateur prize fights, and it was very, very entertaining. All the neighbors, and they have a tremendous crowd. They built up bleachers on a hillside. It was a lot of fun.
The main gravel roads which passed through the forest were built by the Cs in 1934 and 1935. Another program began during the Great Depression was the Works Projects Administration, which built bridges like this one over the Reservoir Brook. The second objective of the forest, to control forest fires, was achieved through the use of a network of woods roads which acted as fire breaks. After work completed in 1931, there was no area larger than 400 acres unbroken by roads. Since that time, no fire has burned greater than 120 acres in Meshomasic. The greater part of the intensive work on the forest ended with the onset of World War II. Men who went to war left stacks of wood in the forest, which today can still be found over 50 years later. The end of the war brought on a new world of challenges, and Meshomasic was to play its role. With the threat of high-flying bombers, the U.S. government picked this forest to locate a Nike installation in the late 40s. From underground silos, Nike Hercules missiles could be fired for distances up to 75 miles. Today, in ironic contrast, the sand-filled silos are used to explode fireworks confiscated during 4th of July celebrations. Made obsolete by more sophisticated weapons, the Nike battery became a young adult conservation corps unit named Camp Meshomasic in the 1970s, to be abandoned in the early 80s due to program cuts. Today's management of the forest is based on the multi-use concept. Forestry is still the primary concern. With oak now the prevalent species, professional foresters practice cutting methods which will ensure its natural regeneration. However, under this multi-use concept, other uses must be taken into consideration. Greater emphasis is placed on aesthetics. Roads are reseeded and tops cut to below 6 feet, reducing the negative visual impact of cutover areas and hastening decomposition of the slash. Recreationally, the Shinipsa Trail, one of several blue-blazed hiking trails throughout the state, starts at the Cobalt Mine, climbs to the overlook on Great Hill, and then continues northward along the ridge to Bolton Notch and eventually to the Massachusetts border. Hunting is also permitted, as evidenced by the many tree stands found throughout the forest. By modifying certain cutting practices, wildlife populations have been encouraged. A few large wolf trees are left for small denning mammals and dead ones for the rare pileated woodpecker. A wildlife pond was created to attract waterfowl and other aquatic animals. The successful reintroduction of the wild turkey, the recent immigration into the state of the eastern coyote, and the increasing number of timber rattlesnakes provides excellent examples of the success of these efforts. The forest also acts as the watershed for the Portland Reservoir. Built in 1889, the reservoir, along with the surrounding town-owned property, is considered part of the larger ecosystem of Meshomasic. Because of this intimate connection, care is taken not to disturb the wooded swamps and streams which filter and detain floodwaters flowing into the reservoir. The Federal Air Traffic Control maintains a beacon station atop one of Meshomasic's highest hills. Natural areas totaling 130 acres in size were established in 1927. No forest activity is permitted on these long-term natural forest research plots, except for measurements taken by the Connecticut's Agricultural Experiment Station personnel. To prevent attracting attention and possible disturbance, their locations are kept confidential. The successful protection of the forest has also seen setbacks caused by disease and insects which play their role in the life of the forest. The red pine, planted so heavily in the CCC days, has fallen victim to the red pine scale, destroying all but a few specimens. The chestnut blight, the gypsy moth, and the woolly adelgid, to name just a few, have changed the character and the composition of the forest, giving further example that natural process is in control, not man. Hurricanes have also wreaked havoc.
In 1938, we had a hurricane come in here that was probably more devastating than anything that anybody could remember for a storm, particularly on the trees in the forest. Besides, it didn't do as much harm to houses as it did to the trees, mainly because we had had a downpour of 5 to 8 inches of rain the day before the actual hurricane. And the ground was so saturated that the majority of these trees were just uprooted. The forest, it looked like a war zone on the southeast slopes of the hills. Over the top of the hills would be some places that wouldn't hardly look as though it would have been touched. But it was a slaughter out there, and there was wood, so much wood that you couldn't do anything with it. The state finally got to the idea that they could use some of it, and they cut a lot of it for cordwood, and then they constructed the charcoal kiln at this time.
Man continues to leave his mark on the forest, not always in the most acceptable way, but a way no less to show his connection to the land. And in turn, the forest leaves a spiritual mark on us. The mystique of a darkened cave, or the illusion of a great beaver or bear on a ledge, the awe of a giant tulip tree, or the light of a white birch brightening the woods, the joy of a vine transforming a road post into an art form, or the fragility of a princess pine clinging to an uprooted stump, the pleasure of a peak to distant hills, or the exhilaration of the expansiveness in a full-view vista. Henry David once wrote, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." And after having drank from the waters of the Meshomasic State Forest and enjoyed the serenity of the forest and watched the animals and the bird life, I think I know what he means by those words. I hope that you can discover the same things that I have discovered in this, your forest, Meshomasic State Forest.